Hey guys, this is Mike, letusreason.com. In one of my recent videos, I began to address a common misunderstanding in the Bible prophecy world, and it's the claim made by some Christians that believers will know, or Christians will know, the times and the season of Christ's return. And to try to validate this idea, they often look to what Paul said in 1 Thessalonians 5:1, where he specifically uses the words times and seasons. As we discussed in that video that I recently did, the truth is actually the total opposite, where the entire point that Paul makes from Thessalonians is that the Thessalonians had no need for him to even speak to them about the times and seasons of the rapture and the beginning of the broad day of the Lord, due to the fact that Jesus' teachings on the parousia, or his coming, were so extremely well known to them already. And that his consistent teaching was always that his parousia was imminent, that he was coming back suddenly, without signs and without warning, that its timing and season is completely unpredictable to everyone, which is why he then used the analogy of a sudden, signless, and unpredictable coming of a thief in the night, where his entire point rests on the common knowledge that a thief's whole objective is to give no signs and no indicators of his coming. And so that's what we discussed in that recent video. But in that video, I also briefly mentioned a similar aspect of this whole subject, where people who believe in this idea of Christians knowing the season also look to an exchange, a conversation that Jesus had with the Pharisees and the Sadducees in Matthew 16. Those were the Jewish religious leaders of that time. And in this exchange, Jesus criticizes them for being able to readily understand the natural signs of the weather. For example, that the sky looks a certain way and it indicates that a weather event is coming. But yet they were completely clueless about the signs of his messianic coming, the spiritual aspect. So they could understand the natural things, but not the spiritual things. And people think that this statement by Jesus is something that we also should apply to ourselves today. In other words, it's the idea that Jesus, if he was here currently on earth today, or from heaven or whatever, that he would potentially berate some of us in a similar way. You know, that Christians today are supposedly unaware of these alleged signs of the times that's supposed to exist today, which they mean to relate to the end times. In other words, these signs are supposed to teach us or alert us or let us know that we're in the end, we're getting close to the end times. It's this idea that there's some signs in the world today that gives us some ability to predict when the coming of the Lord is going to happen, and when the rapture is going to happen, when the tribulation will happen, or in other words, when the end times will begin. And so that's the claim that we're going to put to the test today. Now, before we even go to that passage and take a look at it, for anyone new to this channel who hasn't seen any of my previous videos, it's important to take a moment just to explain what the consistent, continual New Testament teaching is regarding the timing of the Lord's parousia, which the rapture is the opening event of. So another way of saying it is that the beginning of the broad period of the day of the Lord is this beginning of the end times. Now, some people think that the tribulation is the same thing as the broad day of the Lord, but it's not. The tribulation and day of the Lord in its broad sense do not share the same beginning point or the same ending point, so they can't be the same thing. The tribulation is a subset within the larger or broader or wider period called the day of the Lord. The broad day begins with the rapture, and it ends with the ending of the millennium. But we also know the Bible speaks of a culminating or a climactic aspect of the day of the Lord also. And this occurs at the end of the tribulation, when the Lord physically returns to the earth. And this is also the closing or the ending of the period called the parousia. But the beginning of the parousia commences with the rapture of the church, which occurs much earlier. And we know this is the case biblically, since the Bible refers to the Lord's coming to rescue the church, as well as his coming to execute judgment on the world, on the wicked, by using this same word in the Greek, parousia. Now, I've dealt with all this chronological stuff in great detail in past videos, and I've shown you a multitude of quotes from great scholars on this and tons of scripture passages on this. But I just want to mention it here briefly by way of review. It's not really the point of this video, but it's sort of background information that you have to have in order to really understand this video. Now, what I want to get across to you here, and this is review also, since I talk about it in such great depth in many of my other videos, is that the consistent biblical teaching about the timing of the parousia is that it's imminent. Now, the word imminent by definition means it's something that's expected to happen at any moment, something that's able to happen immediately without any precursors or preconditions or prerequisites. It's something that has no signs, because if it had signs, it couldn't be described as imminent because of the requirement of prerequisite signs. Nothing that has signs can be called imminent. And if you think an imminent event has signs, then you're really just not understanding the actual definition of the word imminence. Imminence means sudden, something that can arise without warning, something that's to be thought of as always on the verge of happening, something that there's no minimum amount of time that has to pass before we can expect it to occur. It's just always impending. It's always hanging over our heads, ready to befall us at any moment. That's why Jesus constantly tells us that we need to watch for his coming, because it's an any moment possibility and there are no signs. So that's why we have to continually watch for him himself, which means we have to be spiritually prepared for his coming. And if we're not, then his teaching is that we get left behind to enter the judgment, because the judgment's going to immediately follow. It's going to begin immediately on the unrighteous after the righteous are removed. So it's simultaneous. The rescue and the judgment are simultaneous, and both are imminent because they both take place and begin at the same time. This is the rapture, which occurs at the beginning of the broad period of the day of the Lord. The righteous get removed in the rapture, and then immediate judgment begins on those left behind as the broad period of the day of the Lord starts, which is why Jesus used the example of Noah and then the example of Lot as patterns for his parousia. That was his whole point there with both of those. And this period of time, where both the rescue aspect and the judgment aspect begin simultaneously and without warning. In other words, it's completely unpredictable, which is also part of what's included in the whole Noah and Lot analogies used by Jesus. This is why he used those, and it's explicit in the text. We don't have to wonder about this. It's explained to us by Jesus in that verse. But it's also why Jesus routinely then would expand on these examples even further, then by using the example of the sudden coming of a thief in the night. And then also the equivalent example of the sudden return of a master of a house coming home. Now, in both cases, he was conveying complete suddenness and signlessness. And he was speaking to his followers, righteous people, because he tells them to watch and pray. And he even says the angels don't know the timing. And even the Son himself in his humanity did not know the timing. Nobody can know it, and nobody ever will until it happens. But then it's too late. And if you were spiritually prepared, you get taken. But if you were spiritually unprepared, then you get left behind to enter the immediate judgment that begins, that whole period. Which is why Jesus then followed his usage of Noah and Lot and the thief and the master of the house, then with the giving of the example of the two people in a field and at a mill where one is taken and one is left. So if you follow the pattern, it's always the righteous who are removed as judgment simultaneously begins to fall on the wicked who are left behind. It's a simultaneous occurrence. This is the beginning of the broad period of the day of the Lord. And so I say all of that just to give you a review of the basic chronology of the end times and a review of the way that Jesus always consistently taught about his parousia, which is also exactly what we see then repeated in the epistles and in Revelation by the subsequent New Testament writers and authors. So it's always the same. It's always very clear, very straightforward, and always consistent when you actually use the pattern that he gave us. And so then with that now being said, that the parousia of Christ is always portrayed as sudden and without signs, let's now then look into this common claim about Christians in the church age supposedly knowing the signs of the times and whether this statement of Jesus is actually applicable to us today. So let's go right to that passage. And it reads as follows: The Pharisees also with the Sadducees came, and tempting desired him that he would show them a sign from heaven. He, being Jesus, answered and said unto them, When it is evening, ye say, It will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, it will be foul weather today, for the sky is red and lowering. O ye hypocrites, ye can discern the face of the sky, but can ye not discern the signs of the times? A wicked and adulterous generation seeketh after a sign, and there shall be no sign given to it, but the sign of the prophet Jonas. And he left them and departed. All right, so in this passage, Jesus severely admonishes the unbelieving Jewish religious leaders of his day, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, for their lack of awareness about the signs of his first advent. And if we were to look ahead then to Luke chapter 19, we would see that in verses 41 to 44, Jesus would actually weep over their blatant ignorance of the time of their messianic visitation. And he then prophesies the coming destruction of Jerusalem as a result. But like I said, this example here in Matthew 16 is often used to argue that church age believers today, Christians today, us today, that we should likewise be aware of the alleged signs of the times that supposedly relate to Christ's second advent, which will include the rapture. Now, is this a sound argument? Can we automatically apply first advent principles to the second advent, especially to the church age? Well, to begin to understand this, we need to recognize why Jesus held the religious leaders accountable to the degree that he did. And what was the reason that he expected them to be so acutely aware of the signs and the timing of his first coming? Why was the penalty for their ignorance so great? Well, the answer is simple, and it illustrates the basic difference between Israel and the church. If we look back to the famous Daniel 70 weeks prophecy in Daniel 9:24 to 27, this will start to make sense to us. So God had disclosed there through the angel what we today refer to again as Daniel's 70-week prophecy. And in this passage, the Lord, speaking through the angel, detailed a prophetic 69-week countdown to the Messiah's arrival, which we know turned out to be accurate to the exact year. And this prophecy was fulfilled when Jesus was presented as the King Messiah to Israel. And the exact day of the fulfillment of this was when his triumphal entry into Jerusalem took place. So this was a chronological countdown that Israel was given, an exact countdown to the coming of the Messiah, and they were expected to know it. And also, in addition to this, there were hundreds of highly specific messianic prophecies that Jesus fulfilled during his earthly life and ministry. And so Israel was given hundreds of messianic prophecies for her to recognize that Messiah when he came. As that countdown that they were also given came to a close, which they should have been expecting if they were using that countdown. Now, if you haven't gotten it yet, here's the key. All of these prophecies were given to national Israel and had nothing at all to do with the church age. Now, this is especially obvious even in Daniel 9, verse 24, which explicitly states that the 70 weeks, this prophetic countdown to the Messiah, are exclusively for the Jews and Jerusalem. It literally says that in the prophecy. It says, for thy people and thy holy city. So the Jews were expected to understand the messianic countdown and also, of course, the prophetic signs of his first coming, those miracles that are being fulfilled, those prophecies that are being fulfilled. And these were the signs of the times that God had established centuries beforehand, and they were really intended to act as sort of an unmistakable sign or marker to national Israel that was saying to them, this is your Messiah, don't miss him. They were given every possible reason to be ready for him when he came. They were given that literal countdown. They could have known the exact year to expect him, or at least they should have been sort of generally prepared as they saw it count down and get closer. And it was through all of these things that Israel was intended to correctly identify him at the expected time of his coming. And yet, in the passages here that we see the unbelieving religious leaders actually had the nerve to then ask Jesus for a sign. Think about that for a second. Let that sink in. After all of this, they were given the countdown. They were given all of the prophecies, which they obviously either ignored or were ignorant of. And then they have the nerve to ask him for a sign when he's standing there at the exact right time, right in front of them, having fulfilled all these things. And they're asking him for a sign. It would be like driving down a road, ignoring sign after sign after sign after sign, and then complaining that there's no signs and asking for a sign. So, in response, you can understand then why Jesus scolded them so very severely for their complete lack of awareness about these signs, about this countdown, about these prophecies that he had fulfilled. All of this stuff was messianic, and they were intended to understand it and anticipate it and expect it. So, in other words, as Jesus later says, they didn't recognize the time of their visitation. So then, with this backdrop in mind, we can very easily understand Jesus's seemingly harsh response and why he criticized them. Israel was supposed to be aware of the signs that she was given, but had completely failed. So then, knowing all of that, then here's the question. Does this then have any connection to the church age and the second advent? What were church age believers told concerning Christ's second advent? Were we given a detailed countdown like the Jews were given in Daniel 9? Were we told the exact moment of Christ's second coming? Were we given any specific prerequisite church age prophecies that would act as signs to alert us of the timing of his coming and make it predictable? Or on the other hand, does the New Testament always consistently, routinely speak of the broad period of his second advent, the broad day of the Lord, his parousia, as beginning suddenly, imminently, and without warning? As we've already mentioned, and as I've shown in numerous videos where we've gone far more in depth, and as I talk about in my book, The Missing Key, that's right behind my shoulder there, I go to great lengths in all these resources that are available to you to show you that the correct answer is the latter. The answer is always that it's completely unpredictable and completely sudden, and that it can happen at any time, which is exactly what the actual English word imminent or impending means, which is why Christians have always used that word, despite the fact that that word itself is not used in the Bible. We always use that word because we see that's what the Bible teaches. So anyone who tells you otherwise literally does not understand the actual definition of the word imminent. It's that plain. Look it up. Look it in the dictionary. You'll see. It means impending, an any moment possible coming. Now, you might ask, what about all those signs that Jesus spoke of regarding his second coming? Like the whole sequence of signs that he spoke of in, for instance, the Olivet Discourse, where you have the beginning of birth pang signs and then they continue to build until you eventually see the great tribulation signs, like the abomination of desolation and everything we see in Revelation that corresponds with it about the seals and the trumpets and the bowls. Well, the answer is so very simple. All of these things relate to his second coming at the end of the tribulation, what I like to call the second coming proper, just for precision, because all of it is his second coming. But at the end of the tribulation, I like to call his second coming proper because he physically comes to the earth. And so, in other words, none of these things, none of these signs that Jesus talked about pertain to now. None of them pertain to the church age. None of them are things that the church are told to look for. They happen after we're removed in the rapture as the broad period of the day of the Lord begins. Or, in other words, after the parousia starts, as the judgment begins. It's a sequence of judgments, eschatological judgments, or end times last, judgments that take place at the end. The end times is the next age. It's not the current age. We're in the church age, and the end times are what comes next. And that's when the signs begin, after we're removed. And a lot of what Jesus spoke of, specifically in the Olivet Discourse, largely pertains to Israel. You can see it in the language, talking about the mountains of Judea and the Sabbath and the abomination of desolation, which pertains to the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. This stuff is about Israel and about the world at that time, which has fallen under eschatological judgment. It's not about the church. So again, all of this takes place after the church has been raptured. It does not concern the church age. There are no observable church age signs that give us predictive insight into the beginning of this broad period or into the beginning of the parousia. No, the consistent teaching is always that it's imminent, and therefore no signs were ever given to the church. So then, consequently, understanding all of this, it's then an awful, terrible argument and a horrible misuse of Scripture to draw any equivalence at all between Jesus's criticism of those first century Jewish leaders and today's church age Christians. The two have absolutely nothing to do with one another. And in fact, the entire point is that they're intrinsically opposites. What do I mean by that? Well, while the first advent was predicted exactly down to the exact year and was accompanied by hundreds of specific messianic prophecies, the same cannot be said of now. The beginning of the second advent, or the parousia, which begins with the rapture and the simultaneous broad day of the Lord, is going to take place imminently, with no signs, with no such countdown. There's no equivalent to Daniel 9 for the church. There's just not. Any signs related to the second advent concern a day of the Lord context for national Israel, so that when the church is removed, then Israel starts to experience those signs. Those things become observable at that point, and there's this sequence of judgments that they can then just follow, and it leads up to the coming of Christ in the sky in power and glory. That's the whole point. Once we're gone and the church age comes to a close, the people at that time will be able to predict exactly what's going to happen. Even the tribulation has a definite beginning point. It has a definite midpoint. You can't miss all of this stuff when you're in that time frame, if you're aware of it. So it pertains to a day of the Lord context, not a church age context. Now, here's the thing to notice, guys. Signs were always given to national Israel, relating both to their first 69 weeks, as that 69th week countdown to the Messiah came to pass, and then also their final 70th week, which we often call the tribulation, but never to the church. I want you guys to get this. This is actually a very important and very basic dispensational distinctive. We understand Israel and the church are distinct entities in God's prophetic program, and the way that he deals with each of them is different. Israel was always given signs, while the church was always told to expect him at any moment, that there's no length of time that the Lord has to be gone for, that he's coming soon, quickly, shortly, at hand, without warning, at the door, like a thief, that he's on the threshold of entrance, which is why we need to perpetually be ready for an any moment coming. That's always the teaching, from the Gospels to the epistles to Revelation. It's all throughout. And in fact, I'll say that I've become convinced that it's the imminence of his return is actually the overarching message of the New Testament that Jesus wants believers to remember and to be aware of and to understand. And of course, it is, because that's always what you say when you leave someone and you impart to them an expectation of when you'll be back, what you want them to do in the meantime, how you want them to handle your absence. You say, I can return at any time. Make sure you're watching and ready. It's so simple, guys, but popular YouTube entertainers have found out, of course, that injecting sensationalism and signs and date setting and all kind of unbiblical hype is what gets them clicks and views and followers. That's what it comes down to. So you need to make a decision what kind of content you're going to follow. I decided a long time ago that's not for me. I'm going to follow biblical truth, despite that I know that I'm sacrificing followers and I'm sacrificing everything that comes along with it. And despite that, there's certain very popular prophecy YouTubers who would never want to have me on their show, never want to collaborate with me because they know that I'm not going to go along with all that unbiblical nonsense. So you guys too have to decide. Well, I hope that this has been helpful and has really shed some light on this common misunderstanding that really is so simple and so easy when you just apply some basic biblical understanding to it. So, guys, please leave me a comment. Let me know what you think. If you've heard people use this passage to justify watching for signs. And do me a favor and share this video so that more people can be exposed to what I believe is sound Bible teaching. So leave me a comment. Let me know what you think. God bless you guys, and I will see you on the next video.